He knows that his reader is going to expect certain things, and he wants to show his skill, right? And his Greek is maybe it's a choice. Maybe it's just not the best. Maybe he's still learning. But he's an amazing craftsman of plot and narrative, even if the literary skill isn't there, if you see what I mean. So he's able to communicate that sense of secrecy, ironically, through his use of repetition. And then if you do know about Homer or Odysseus, if you've been educated enough, you're going to appreciate the craft, right? That he's managed to make this choice and fuse it in and make Jesus like a Homeric hero.
If you're familiar with the Gospel of Mark, you've likely heard of the concept of the Messianic Secret. But what if this isn't something that is actually that unique to Mark? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, I'm very happy to be joined again by Dr. Robyn Walsh for a discussion about the Messianic Secret and some of the parallels that exist for the Messianic Secret outside of the Gospel of Mark that you should be aware of, that Mark is probably pulling on. And some of these are really big names that you might be surprised that you haven't seen as the same type of pattern before. For example, Odysseus in the Odyssey. You have the same type of hidden identity happening there. So why haven't we seen it? What in scholarship has led to the specific perspective we've had on this role, and what can we do to resolve these problems? Because Robyn's not arguing that this idea of the secret isn't there, but that we have been approaching it wrong. And if we recontextualize Mark within the broader world of Greco-Roman literature, we can get something new. So settle in. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Remember, for early access to ad-free podcasts and exclusive bonus content, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. Let's settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about the real story behind the Messianic Secret. Robyn, thank you so much for taking the time to come back to talk today about one of these terms that people know, but as we were just talking about, most people have never actually read about and probably don't really know this idea of the Messianic Secret. So I appreciate you taking the time to come and get into the weeds on this, sometimes what feels like a magical solution that isn't actually that.
Yeah, the term itself, first of all, thanks for having me back. And you were my first visit with the new computer. So if anything goes wrong, I'm going to blame it on that. But I'm excited to be here with my new machine. But yes, this term, Messianic Secret, comes from a scholar named William Wrede, and he was writing in German. He wrote a book about this idea of the Messianic Secret in German. I won't bother trying to pronounce the German, but it came out around 1901. And it really hit a note with people. I kind of, I'll use this German, it hit the zeitgeist. And people really loved this concept as a way to organize their thinking around the Gospel of Mark. So if anybody has read the Gospel of Mark, even if you haven't and you've heard this idea of Messianic Secret, you probably know the contours of it, which is that Jesus in that Gospel, you don't get that baby Jesus story. You jump right into Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, and then he goes out, the pneuma, the Spirit drives him out to perform all of his various actions, including healings, miracles, and so forth, the things people know about. And throughout all of that activity in the Galilee, on his way to Jerusalem, whenever he comes into contact with the various crowds, whenever he walks into a town, people are mesmerized. They're marveling. This is usually the language that gets translated into English. Sometimes they are so full of wonder, they're kind of going crazy. It's the word in the way the Greek is structured. And the word involved in Greek is thauma. Or thaumatos. It has like different, the root itself is kind of thauma, and it has different variations. But it's a term that is widely deployed in ancient literature. And we could talk about some examples, including in the epics, Homer, Virgil in Latin, but the same kind of idea of wonder, or even in some of the so-called paradoxographers in antiquity. It's actually really all over the place. But wonder, this idea of thauma, occurs quite frequently. But when Jesus comes into these spaces, this kind of thauma is instilled in the people who are encountering him and he performs some kind of miracle, usually right after they'll go, who was that guy? Also part of this Thelma construction. What was that? Who was this guy? Whoa, like, again, I'm kind of going out of my mind. Like, what was this about? And he'll go, shh, or he'll say, don't say anything.
Don't say anything about me. Don't say anything
Don't say anything about it. Keep this a secret. Even the disciples kind of don't know who he is. They keep going like, hey, they're just following him around like, who's this dude? Nobody seems to understand who he is. His activity, although overt, is shrouded in secrecy. And so when Wrede wrote this book, he said, well, this is the Messianic Secret. And do you want me to talk about what he says in that book?
Yeah, can we go into what he says? Because this outline, I think, is helpful to remind everybody, here's the broad parameters. Because this is one of those categories of descriptions of text that I think gets slapped around so often. People just smile and nod and say, yeah, I kind of know some of this, but not so much. But you were saying that what he actually talks about this and the way and the timeline complicates a little bit more of the way we have simplified the use of it now. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. So when he writes his story, when he writes his monograph on the Messianic Secret as this explanatory model for the thing that we just described, the wonderment and misrecognition and secrecy that's throughout Mark. He says, well, my colleagues, I don't want to put too much stank on this. So I'm going to try to restrain myself, but I've worked on this a lot. It's very interesting. He'll say, my colleagues, they act like they're personal friends with Jesus. They're always saying Jesus thinks this and Jesus thinks that. And he says that there's sort of like a psychologizing superstitionist that goes on. And I want to really make this concrete. I'm going to look at the text. And then he goes on to be like, Jesus thinks this, Jesus thinks that. So it is kind of funny to me when I read it. But I think it made an impact because he coupled this different structure for understanding that Jesus had the intention of delaying the recognition of him as Messiah. Mm-hmm. And that messianic determination on Jesus's part, which is a psychologizing move, again, in some ways, was an intentional intervention on Mark's part to do two things. One is explain why didn't anybody recognize that historical Jesus was the Messiah in his lifetime. And so Mark, again, an intervention to try to explain this away. But to also explain, again, this literary feature that he's identifying, which is in this text, why doesn't Jesus want anyone to know? Mm-hmm. Why is this Thelma thing that we're so familiar with happening? Although he doesn't specifically talk about that as a literary feature, the Thelma, but he does acknowledge the secrecy, obviously, and, Jesus's activity, afterwards, recurring over and over again. He's trying to explain that as a literary matter. And so that, I suspect, combination of, attack, sort of, attack and reversal, right? Like, you guys are all doing this thing. I'm going to bring us back to the text. I'm going to bring us back to these different principles. And even though the language ends up kind of being similar, that made it relatable, I think, to people. And so this idea of like, well, the Messianic Secret is Jesus as Messiah has determined he has to delay the acknowledgement, the recognition of his role, because as soon as people recognize that he's the predicted Messiah, he knows he's going to be crucified. He has this pre-knowledge of what's going to happen. And so that becomes, again, this organizing principle that people have used since 1901. I mean, I know when I was coming up in the field, I was still hearing the idea of Messianic Secret. I'm sure it has a Wikipedia page. It has become, I think, still, especially ironically in the English-speaking world, the predominant model from, I've actually done an N-gram study on this. It has remained, and increasingly so, over the years, throughout the 20th century, the main model that people use to describe the Gospel of Mark.
What do you think it is about this framework that has allowed it to not just be popular in its emergence, but continue on in this way? This is seemingly unchallenged.
Well, I mean, people have challenged it, but I think it's so neat. It's just so tightly boxed with a little bow on it. It's a very, very confusing element. And I think it agitates against ideas we have broadly, culturally, religiously, and not in the abstract, but when I say broadly, I think we tend to think of Jesus I'm thinking about iconography where he's like holding a lammy.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Like, I think we have this idea of Jesus because he is ministering to the poor, to the sick. In his teachings, he's advocating for the less than. We do have this more, I would say, compassionate, maybe, or accessible idea of Jesus. So then when you read the Gospel of Mark, and you have, frankly, a very grouchy, I mean, I used to ask my students, like, who would you cast in a Hollywood movie after you've read the Gospel of Mark to play Jesus? And I used to get people like Samuel L. Jackson, like right after Pulp Fiction, like around that. So I would get like more of these kind of cantankerous suggestions, I would say. And that's just how, despite what people think of the level of the Greek, the characterization of this figure does come through. So to say like, oh, well, he had to do it. I mean, there's different ways that you could argue this. Well, he had to be that way because he had to delay the Messianic recognition. Oh, he had to be that way because it was a secret. Secrecy dominates, the entire text, and so on and so forth. So I think you could come at that question from different angles, but I think I've established in just that one explanation sort of a crux of the different moving pieces that you might look at to explain why it's had such a hold on us in the field.
When you look at it as something that exists in Mark, and this explanation of one way to explain some of what's happening in Mark, but something that is not unique to Mark, that, as you've mentioned, is happening in these other ancient texts. Is that something that is discussed in the early development of this, or is this idea of the Messianic secret presented as something unique to Mark and distinct among this perspective, this character, this story?
I want to be careful because I have not read everything in the world. And so I don't want to not acknowledge someone who has maybe looked at this since 1901. Right? However, in my own research on the subject, I have not found too many people acknowledging the literary features in such a way that I don't see some slippage back to historical Jesus, some slippage back into how do we psychologize this character. And if you don't mind, I'll reveal that before we hit record, I was talking to you a little about this, and this might seem like an odd analogy, but I was noticing it when Euphoria was ending, because I'm always on TikTok, when I'm not.
I think Euphoria is the show everyone thinks of when they finish reading Mark. They probably go like, the companion show to this is.
Like, who would I cast? I mean, if I ask that question in the fall, everyone's going to say Jacob Elordi. Tomorrow's my birthday. I suggested a Jacob Elordi theme. Anyway, like, he's just everywhere. He's everywhere. But, when I'm not being a scholar or a mom or whatever, I'm on TikTok like everyone else. So when Euphoria was ending, it was, I can't help but think about work all the time, no matter what I'm doing. And all of this discourse around, like, what does Cassie really think? And we were saying, like, well, Cassie doesn't exist. Cassie's a character, and it's Sydney Sweeney, and I don't know, right? But we have this tendency, like, this is what literature does. This is what these kinds of stories do. They're an entree for us to start thinking about our own positions in the world. This is how storytelling is a way to think about things like virtue and vice, or why we would read a biography about somebody. We not only learn about historical trends, but we learn about biographical details of somebody's decision-making and so on and so forth. So, we do that with Jesus too, even if we're sort of aware, like, oh, this might be a literary strategy. So I have not seen much in terms of people talking about the literary strategy, because I think there have been other concerns that people have had that shade into that area of, what does Cassie think?
And,
right?
And it becomes more of a theological strategy rather than a literary strategy.
Absolutely.
Inside
So
of
I see it, as more unique, the approach and the treatment of something like the Gospel of Mark. And, something we haven't really talked about, but is implicit here, is that it's a religious text, right?
Yeah.
And so you treat religious texts, and I'm sure we have had conversations, and people know, like, the canon's much later. Gospel of Mark didn't get born into a world in which it was automatically scripture. That is a social development. It's contingent. It takes time. But, let's put that aside. Let's think about how this text functions now. It's scripture, it's a gospel, it's a canonical gospel. And so people can't help but approach it in that way. And so whether it's a faith-based perspective, a scholarly perspective, a lot of the same questions obtain. And so people will approach it in that traditional method. And something like the Messianic Secret is a very convenient, again, seemingly literary strategy, intervention, theological explanation, logical, a nice little bow, again, like nice, tidy structure for understanding something that's otherwise, why do I have a grumpy Samuel L. Jackson, Jason Elordi, Jesus that I have to deal with here?
If we put Mark's Messianic Secret then in conversation with another text that is approaching this format as a literary convention, is there an ancient text you think people should reach to if they're wanting to come back to this idea in Mark with new eyes, to try to break out of just reading it as a theological text or in the context of religious text? Because they may say, I don't know of another I can reach to do this. Where would you tell them to go?
That's totally normal, right? Like that completely makes sense. And, it's not where people would necessarily begin. But one thing that I always ask myself is, what did Mark have at his disposal as a model? But also, we have to set aside here, too, the idea of oral tradition, which we haven't talked about, where there is some assumption that there's oral tradition or groupthink somewhere behind Mark. Let's bracket that for now. We can come back to it. But if you don't know where to look, you might go back to, historical Jesus, oral tradition, these are stories that people told, and that's the source, right? But yes, when you start to think what's at Mark's disposal, but also very concretely about, we know Mark went to school. We can consider school here like in quotes, right? We call it paideia, is the term we use in Greek to describe how people learned in antiquity, whether he's learning at home, on his own time, because he has the leisure time, whether he went to some kind of formalized schooling, whether he had a tutor, and whatever the situation was for Mark, somebody taught him Greek. At some point, he had some kind of schooling to teach himself. And what was the number one thing in all evidence, regardless of education level, writing level, prose, sophistication, so on and so forth, that anybody who can produce prose literature learned in school? Number one, Homer, right? So whenever we ask this question about, especially imperial age literature, but ancient Greek literature, it always almost goes back to Homer, which frankly can be a little annoying if you're not a big Homer fan.
You're not eagerly anticipating the release of Christopher Nolan's Odyssey in what is going to be a very convenient timeline between this and that.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's never, I like Euripides. Like, we all have our thing, right? We all have our thing. I'm like a Lucian Euripides kind of person, like on my own time. I've started to appreciate Cicero more. I like his letters. He's funny. Pliny, hilarious. I'm starting to, broaden my horizons. But if I'm at the beach, I'm not popping it's just not for me. But I had to, because I was trying to figure out, where do I see evidence perhaps of the way that Mark might have gone to school, his level of education, how he had been trained. And frankly, if just looking at the Odyssey, and we're just talking about how I've been working on this, when the hero, the main character of a story, in this case Odysseus, but this goes throughout ancient Greek literature and Latin literature. When the hero comes into town, when the hero reveals themselves in one way or another, especially one on a journey, which the epics almost always have, they are almost always not recognized at first. And what's the Greek word when Odysseus is, found, at the edge of the river, and, he's all bedraggled, and people, are in the town pick him up, and, he washes himself off, and he goes in to the kingdom and is essentially saved. What's the word that every maiden uses, that every king uses, that everybody uses when they see Odysseus? Thalma. So he remains the stranger for, I think, 9 or 10 books. He doesn't tell anybody who he is until like book 10. And he's been hanging out for like days. Right? And they keep saying, who is this stranger clearly come from heaven? I am in wonder, Thalma, over and over again. And he never reveals who he is. He decides when he reveals who he is at the right moment. And even other characters in this story will say things like, well, this guy clearly has a fate behind him that he's going to exercise. He's clearly come down from heaven and he will reveal himself in due time. So even something like that, right? It's so closely aligned to exactly what's happening with Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. The Spirit comes down. He becomes God's son. People clearly know he's some kind of strange being. He's some kind of stranger with these crazy abilities that come into their midst, but they're just struck with wonder. They don't understand. He doesn't reveal himself until the right time. So if you go back to Homer, it's all over there. It's all over Paradoxography, as I mentioned. Also, Virgil picks it up, and Virgil also learned from Homer. So when you read Virgil, you see it with certain characters like Camilla, especially if a character is paradoxical. So Camilla is a warrior, but also a woman. Nobody really expects that. So when she comes in on horseback, people are like, oh my God, I'm going out of my mind. I don't understand. How could she be both? And it's that same kind of wonder, secrecy, retention, reveal that goes on. And so it's so common. It's so common across all of this literature that I can imagine little Mark learning in school. He would have had exercises. We have school papyri. There's a scholar named Teresa Morgan. The book was published in 1998. She has on literate education. It was re-released in 2000. So it's a little old now. There's been more papyri found and more ostraca and other objects that we know students learned on. But she has these really handy charts in the back where she actually shows you how many extant school exercises do we have based on different kinds of writing. And guess who's front and center? The first 9 books of the Odyssey, right? So I can imagine baby Mark learning Greek and having to do all kinds of homework assignments and exercises around the characterization of Odysseus. And he picked this one thing up, that when you have a hero come into a territory with these miraculous powers or other kinds of objectives, usually he withholds revelation of who he is, and people are struck with wonder.
When you see the secrecy in Mark then in this light, in looking towards Odysseus or other characters, does it change for you how you think Mark is trying to use this or adapt this, or what they expect the audience's reaction to be, instead of something that is this theological approach or like that type of shush, here's not who I am, that we miss, that we need to first plug back in to say, hey, the first thing to try to pay attention to, the first thing to try to wash your eyes of is this, now that you have some of these other companions. Because you're not going to see it as Odysseus. There's a little bit of a difference. But
of course,
what's the thing that Mark you think is then doing with it?
Well, I think what it shows us, people are always endlessly and rightfully so interested. We mentioned the historical Jesus, but the historical gospel writer and their methods and their sources. We talk about this all the time. And then usually there are features of these texts that we find perplexing in modernity that I don't think were perplexing in antiquity. For example, why is Jesus keeping his identity a secret?
Yeah.
So we just kind of handled that. Another one that I recently talked about in an article that came out called Miracle-Mongers. And, we can maybe put a link to it or email me if
Absolutely.
you want to copy. Actually, I think it might be open access. Well, I'll double check on that. But it just came out in a journal called Judaica. But in that, I talk about time telling in Luke, and I compare it to paradoxography. And people
can you explain what paradoxography is for someone who's...
Yes. Yeah, it's okay, I'm going to say something that people who study paradoxography do not like, and I want them to know that I hear them and I respect them, and I know that this is traumatic. Ripley's Believe It or Not. Okay? It's actually pretty close. Like it doesn't cover all of it, but paradoxographical texts tend to talk to you about fantastic things that have happened kind of out the outskirts of the empire, or like strange details about people, animals, objects, places that are supposed to be, again, paradoxical per the name, but kind of these wondrous ephemera that give you an idea of like how bizarre the world can be. So somebody in Thessaloniki lived to be 270 years old. Like just a little vignette that would tell you about that. There's a guy named Rufus of Philippi who I heard resurrected after 3 days. There was a baby born in Rome under the office of such and such a governor who had the head of Anubis, and they threw it in the Tiber. Right? I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh at throwing a head of Anubis baby, but I don't think that happened. So I giggle. But this kind of thing is what you find in paradoxography, and it's usually ranked by kind of type, story type. And then you see features of it in storytelling like Plutarch, or a story about, we heard that there was a guy who rode the back of a dolphin, all the way across the ocean. Those kinds of wonderful, wondrous stories we call paradoxography. And so we do have some of these collections that are the Ripleys, believe it or not, a guy who ate, however many tacos. Versus, features within a literary tradition. So that's what that is. But this article where I talk about time telling, one thing that paradoxography does is it loves to mark time according to who was in office at a certain period of time. So I mentioned the head of Anubis, so-and-so was provincial governor at this time when there's one about somebody found a centaur and mummified it and put it in the storehouse of the emperor. So, these are just like little snippets that I can have on automatic recall, but it's almost always, again, time telling with somebody who's in office. And so I looked into scholarship on time telling in Luke. I looked at Francois Bauvin's Harmonious series. I read some work by some other scholars, Paula Fredrickson and other people who have worked on this. And it's been very perplexing. How do we understand Luke's time telling? Because in his baby Jesus story, his infancy narrative, he mentions a census under Augustus, a worldwide census makes zero sense. Really. I mean, it makes a little sense, but not with the kind of records we have, not to go back to your homeland from like multiple generations before. But we know Augustus is in power. These references to the Herodian family that you have both in Matthew and Luke, but in Luke specifically, also Quirinius being governor of Syria, and the time that he's listing does not match up with what we know historically, right? And so that has been perplexing theologically, historically. How do we resolve this, especially for those who think the Gospels can't be wrong, right, historically, but here it is a patently unresolvable issue. But if you look at paradoxography, that's how you tell time. And what are the Gospels if not a collection of wondrous things that this one guy has done, right? And so that to me tells us something about whether it's Mark or Luke or any of these other writers, not just source material, but influence, structure, what they want, as you say, recognized by their readers. And not just recognized, but what's expected, right? So if you're going to tell this remarkable story about this baby that is going to grow up and, perform all these miracles and is the Messianic savior of the world, and you're going to tell that story with full of wonder, you're going to tell time the way that you've been both taught, but a reader's going to expect to hear it. And similarly, I think Mark made the decision his Jesus was going to be an epic hero. He was going to be an Odysseus. He was going to be a Virgilian kind of this was going to be a foundational story for Jesus and the development of potentially the Jesus movement. But how else do I tell the story about this far-flung place in the empire and this guy who's sending demons into swine and, healing withered hands and, hemorrhaging women and so on and so forth, multiplying wheat. And, now I'm combining different Gospels, so you get my point. Like when you start to think about resurrecting a child, Talitha, you're presenting paradox, both in terms of his actions, how you imagine people would react to those reactions, what readers would expect from anybody observing those reactions, but then also a Messiah who's going to be crucified. What is more paradoxical than that? So I think the stage is set, and that tells us why you see this approach with these different writers.
So when you are looking at this, for a listener coming through and hearing now, I hear some challenges to the framework of the Messianic Secret, or the way maybe it's been applied. For you, it's not that that doesn't exist, but that some of the way it's been there has maybe misidentified features that we can better understand if we look to something else. So it's a widening of the way we're reading this rather than a shutting it off.
It's a widening. I'm not shutting it off. I'm also trying to say, this is something that if we keep that lens, to your widening point, too narrow, if we assume that the Gospels, because we read them theologically and they have theological weight to them, are different, fundamentally different kinds of literature, then we lose a touchstone with exactly what I've been monologuing about for the last 20 minutes. But we lose a touchstone with where do the comparisons, the more fruitful comparisons, where do they lie? And so I was just in Austria, and I gave a paper in Vienna and one in Innsbruck, and I talked about this because I'm working on a book. And the first question I got in Innsbruck after I did this whole thing about Homer and Virgil and Mark and Messianic Secret was, nobody else has seen that? Because it just seems so obvious.
Once you say it, you go, that makes a ton of sense. And even some of the stuff for Odysseus, where you have some of that paradoxical on the fringes of, as you're traveling around these faraway places and peoples that you're running into, you say it and you go, yeah, it feels everywhere. And is kind of surprising given the time and the place this comes out of, Germany, 1900s, and love of Homer and that's not a part of how this is discussed in its formation.
Well, even if it's mentioned, right? Like, so here's one example where I think it gets mentioned. I hope. I hope I'm not the only. So some people will say there are occasions in Mark where Jesus is amazed at the lack of faith or the doubt of, say, the disciples, or after he's performed a miracle. And like, what's with these people? Back to grouchy Jesus. And Thelma's used. Right. So it's not just people wondering about Jesus. Jesus is like, oh my, I don't want to say, oh my God, but yeah, I think he can't, of anybody, he can say that. So he's having that reaction to these people around him. He can't believe who he's dealing with, essentially. But Odysseus does the same thing. He does wonder. Now, he doesn't wonder like, oh, these people, he's not as frustrated, but he'll talk about how he wonders about in his journeys. He saw this, tree that was really remarkable, or, a beautiful maiden that he wonders at. So, there's a mutuality to the wonder. It's not just one-sided. And so I wouldn't be surprised if I went back to Wrede and did a search for Homer. I'm sure, because as I've mentioned, everyone knows Homer was the foundational source of education, the foundational literary model. Sometimes I make the analogy to most people have to encounter Shakespeare at some point. Now, like P.S. Shakespeare stole it all from the guys we're talking about, but let's forget that for a second. But we all go back to Shakespeare, who also, that's because of the Germans and their educational system, but I'm going down a wormhole anyway. Most people in high school, most people by the time that they're able to form more sophisticated prose have, like, even if they didn't quite understand it, they have,
you had
even
to
if they
read
had Cliff Notes.
something. Yeah.
I read the Cliff Notes. I'll just admit it. I had to read Portrait of a Lady. I didn't want to do it. I got the Cliff Notes. But I did learn about character and structure and plot, right? Like we all, if we go through that kind of schooling, eventually come across these models. And so that might be acknowledged. But I don't know, again, for all the barriers we've talked about and reasons we've been talking about, I don't think this connection that I identify in that article I mentioned, or that I'm working on right now, I'm not sure they've gotten the full treatment. And so it's nice to open up a new conversation where we can look at this in more depth as a field.
And it taps onto the difficulty of identifying the way texts are talking about or talking with each other when it's not something like, I am responding to this person, I'm responding to this thing as a critique. Those ones feel obvious. But these types of things, the allusions, especially from so far removed now in time, or when you're coming to it from a completely different perspective, are the things that can be so easy to miss until someone points it out and you feel like, oh yeah, how did I not see that this part was in here? And it's not that type of like deflating of the text, but a new way back into it.
And what's interesting is it shows the flexibility of these texts. And I think that goes a long way for explaining their staying power. Because sometimes people might say like, well, I don't understand how the Bible, the Gospels, the scriptures have managed to be interpreted and reinterpreted and refashioned over time in such a way that they continue to be revelatory for people. And I'm going to make another analogy that might get me in trouble, but have you ever, I mentioned my son a minute ago, but having to watch cartoons, or we're way into Dogman in this house right now. We were into Dogman before the movie, but we're like, we got all the Dogman books. We're way into it. And when I read Dogman, there's 2 levels of discourse there, right? There's the level of discourse that the kid loves. And there's the level of discourse that I get the jokes. Like I know when it's an allusion to a weird 70s song, right? Or I know, because we all know from the titles, my son has no idea. I mean, I've now told him, but like the Scarlet Shredder, he doesn't know about the Scarlet Letter, right? And I have to tell him, or Wuthering Heights, like I explained Wuthering Heights to Jacob Elordi, Wuthering Heights to him. And, like I tell him like, oh, it's based on this book and so on and so forth, or like who Hemingway is, right? When we get to that one. So it's communicating on those two registers. The parent is entertained and the child is entertained. And so that's really interesting to me, because I think what you have with Mark is that he knows how he's been educated. He knows that his reader is going to expect certain things, and he wants to show his skill, right? And his Greek is maybe it's a choice. Maybe it's just not the best. Maybe he's still learning. But he's an amazing craftsman of plot and narrative, even if the literary skill isn't there, if you see what I mean. So he's able to communicate that sense of secrecy, ironically, through his use of repetition. He loves to use this, the phrase in Greek is, it's 2 words, it's kaiuthos, which means we translate it as immediately. Yeah. So he says, and immediately, and kai is and. So, and immediately, and immediately, and immediately. But it gives you that sense of like, like he's here, then he's here, then he's here. It's like, it's very, like it adds to the mystery. And then if you do know about Homer or Odysseus, if you've been educated enough, you're going to appreciate the craft, right? That he's managed to make this choice and fuse it in and make Jesus like a Homeric hero and address that paradoxographical or the paradox problem of the Messiah crucified up front with the secrecy approach. And then you still are entertained by the story, even if you have no idea. Yeah. Right?
Even if you don't know those parts.
Yeah, even if you don't know. But if you do know what the standards are for paradoxographical figures, for figures in far-flung places of the empire, with Rome as kind of that conceptual literary center, you're going to appreciate what he's done on that level too. So yeah, Gospel of Mark's like Dogman.
So if you were looking to re-enjoy the Gospel of Mark, you can either go and read Dogman first, or if you are hoping to enjoy the Odyssey or Mark, maybe you have some homework before you go and see Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. You can reread The Real Thing and Mark, or watch that and then reread Mark as a way back into some of this secrecy, whatever way you want to come back in. Look at it again, find new ways into the Messianic Secret, which is something is there, but maybe it's not there in the way you would thought.
Highly recommend Weenie Wars. The Weenie Wars in Dogman is my favorite. So yeah, maybe I'll assign that to my students in the fall. Like,
Weenie Wars, Mark, the Odyssey, and Mark. Your 3 reading recommendations, in addition to some journal articles. So we'll have some links down below for your homework needs as you come forward. Robyn, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk about this. I really appreciate it. It's always a joy, and you never quite know what examples you're going to get. It's a blast. I love it, and it is so much fun. So thank you for coming to walk through the Messianic Secret. It's not all wrong, but it's also not all right, and that's the best kind of thing.
Thank you so much for having me.
For all of you watching, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.